Welcome, adventurers, to the final installment of the class comparison video series, where we normally take a look at two classes and see how they stack up against each other. But since there are 23 classes in the system, I didn't want to have an odd class out, so we're going to instead have a 3-class comparison to close this all out. And what we've got left is the Alchemist, the Gunslinger, and the Magus. So why these 3? Partially because, well, that is what is left. But I do think there are actually some pretty strong similarities between these. I often hear the Alchemist and the Gunslinger in association with each other due to being somewhat rooted in the real-world mechanics of ancient alchemy and ancient chemistry and firearms. And I do think that the Alchemist and the Magus have some similarities because both are excellent classes for triggering weaknesses with fire or acid or cold or, those kind of elemental weaknesses on enemies. So it is kind of a grab bag and it's just kind of what's left, but we're going to go with it. Let's talk about some similarities first, starting by comparing the Alchemist to the Gunslinger. As I already mentioned, these two do have a pretty similar flavor to them. The Alchemist uses something called infused reagents, which are basically chemicals, raw chemicals, to make bombs, elixirs, mutagens, and poisons. And none of these are magic items. They are alchemical items. They're basically chemistry. Meanwhile, that Gunslinger is a crossbow and firearms expert, and this is also not magical by nature. And I would say the firearms presumably use a lot of the same alchemical compounds to propel those firearm projectiles forward that are found in the alchemical bombs. There's actually even an alchemical crossbow that the Gunslinger could use, and there's a feat for the Gunslinger called alchemical shot. So it's really not hard to imagine an alchemist and a Gunslinger working together, swapping reagents, swapping things around, and being the bestest of friends. And then if we compare the Alchemist to the Magus, I think both of these classes are very, very good at discovering and then exploiting weaknesses of enemies. I mean, not as good as the Thaumaturge, because that's what they do, but pretty good nonetheless. The Alchemist has a batch of daily infused reagents that I talked about earlier, and they can prepare a bunch of items in the morning as part of daily preparations using these reagents, but they can also save some reagents for later in the day to use with quick alchemy. For a single action, an alchemist can take infused reagents and make any item that they have in their formula book. So if you get into a scrap and you figure out that the creature has a weakness to cold, well, you can quick alchemy and then use a frost vial, which is a type of bomb. Or you could use the energy mutagen, which you consume, and then you would apply cold damage to every single one of your strikes for, I think, the next minute after that. And the Magus actually has a core class feature, which is very similar to that energy mutagen. After casting a spell, the Magus can enter their arcane stance using a core class feature called Arcane Cascade. When they do so, the latent energy from that spell is then imbued into their strikes. So using that same example of a creature who has a weakness to cold damage, that Magus could cast Frostbite, doing some cold damage, and then enter their Arcane Cascade stance. Then all of their strikes will use cold damage in addition to the regular damage and trigger that weakness. And then what about similarities to the Gunslinger? Well, one thing I did not mention earlier is that there is actually a Gunslinger way, one of the subclasses, the way of the spell shot. And guess what? That also applies elemental damage to their strikes. So yes, all 3 of these classes have the ability to consistently trigger weaknesses of enemies. Look at that. We're tying this junk drawer all together. With knowing this, let's take a look at how these classes typically fare in combat, starting with the Alchemist, who admittedly does struggle at times. They are an intelligence-based class, so they won't have full accuracy on any of their weapon strikes. I do think that the bomber subclass is pretty good because bombs deal splash damage, so you can actually hit multiple targets, and they actually still will deal splash damage even on a miss. So imagine fighting something with a weakness to your bomb. You miss, but you still do that splash damage, and you still trigger that weakness, and you still apply a fair amount of damage even on a miss. The other subclasses of the Alchemist I do think suffer a little bit more. The Chirurgeon I like, but it is mostly a healing class with no real combat bonuses. The Mutagenist relies on those mutagens, which tend to be complicated and give you debuffs in addition to buffs, so you could potentially take the wrong mutagen and just do harm to yourself and not help yourself out at all. And then the Toxicologist uses poisons, which I think are a bit too hit and miss and kind of lack the stopping power that you typically need in combat. On to the Gunslinger. Well, first of all, they are a dexterity-based class, which is great for their ranged weapon accuracy, but they are also an expert in their crossbows and firearms. Now, neither the firearms nor crossbows will do a ton of damage on a regular hit, but given that expert proficiency, you will do a lot of chip damage. And then, of course, with the plus-minus-10 system of Pathfinder 2nd Edition, well, you will land crit hits more often. And critical hits with firearms are huge. That's because most of the firearms have at least the deadly, if not the fatal, trait on them. So when you land a strike with a fatal trait weapon, you upgrade your weapon dice, you roll your damage, you double it, and then you roll another dice on top of it. So if you like consistently doing a little bit of damage, and then honestly fairly often doing huge amounts of damage, the Gunslinger is going to be a really good choice for you. And I think the Magus is a little bit in between the Alchemist and the Gunslinger. First of all, they actually are a martial character. Despite using magic, they are either strength or dexterity based, but they are not experts with their strikes, so their accuracy will be in between the Alchemist and the Gunslinger. They can land some really big hits due to their core class feature called Spell Strike. For 2 actions, you make a melee strike, and you imbue an attack spell into that melee strike. So it is 2 actions for what would normally be 3 actions, and it is a single attack with no multiple attack penalty. I mean, unless you attack with your first action, rather than making 2 attacks with the second having the multiple attack penalty. So this is really, really solid, and it can land some absolutely huge hits. But you can't use it back to back to back. After you use a spell strike, you do have to recharge it by either just taking an action to recharge it, or by casting your Conflux spell, which is your focus spell. So this, along with that Arcane Cascade example I gave earlier, is why that Magus is often called out as a sort of action-hungry class. It can be really devastating when all of your actions line up the way that you need them to, but you can also be just one action short of doing what you need to do. Well, how do these classes fare outside of combat? We'll start with the Alchemist, who I think actually does really quite well in exploration. Remember, they are intelligence-based, so they're going to have a lot of skill training, and they will be especially good at crafting. Their alchemical items can also be very helpful in exploration mode. With items like the Silver Tongue mutagen and the Cognitive mutagen, well, you can get your way through social situations or fact-finding endeavors. And remember, the Alchemist can make and use these items on their own, or they can make the items and supply them to the rest of their party. So that Alchemist can potentially be very helpful in drawing out vital information, or tricking a guard, or just convincing someone to help your party. Another thing I often fail to mention with intelligence is that you will be able to learn more languages, because that is tied to your intelligence score. And this is also very important for exploration. In one of my campaigns, there were multiple instances where my Alchemist character was the only character who could speak the language of some of the NPCs, and that got us so much information, got us out of potentially really nasty encounters, helped us solve mysteries. It was really helpful. So even though that Alchemist sometimes does suffer in combat, I think they are really quite strong in exploration. And I think that the Gunslinger is almost the opposite. They are primarily combat focused, and they don't really offer that many exploration abilities. There are some fun feats like the ability to pick a lock by shooting it, but they won't necessarily have a lot of skill training, and most of their feats are combat focused. One nice thing is that they truly are single attribute dependent. They really just need dexterity, and that does give you the flexibility to put your points into other abilities and create some good exploration opportunities for yourself. So they're not bad per se, but maybe they're just a bit more of a blank slate with less of a starting point than the Alchemist and some of the other stronger roleplay classes. And again, I would say the Magus is a little bit in between. They are a limited spellcasting class, and I always think that being able to cast spells is helpful in exploration. But they do have a limited number of spells, and remember they are dexterity or strength based, so they won't have as high of a spellcasting DC as the true casters. Still though, you can prepare an illusory disguise or sleep, or one of the other many spells from the arcane spell list that tend to be pretty good outside of combat. Now let's take a moment to talk about the relative difficulty of these classes, starting again with that Alchemist. Their mechanics are almost exclusively unique to that class. There are some subclasses and some ancestry feats that grant access to alchemical-like abilities, but for the most part, you are on your own there. And then the items that you make require a really good knowledge of statuses and weaknesses and lots of other rules and aspects of the game, so the Alchemist is kind of a tough choice, especially for beginners, even though that is how I got started. The Magus can also maybe be a little bit difficult given the rules for Spell Strike and Arcane Cascade and the difficulty of managing your actions. You also do have to learn about martial abilities in addition to learning about magic abilities, which is obviously going to be more difficult than focusing just on one or on the other. The Gunslinger, I would say, is relatively easy. They do have some bonus actions and specialty reloads from their Gunslinger way, their subclass. So it's not just as simple as learning how to use a firearm in the system or a crossbow and making a strike, but really it's a lot simpler than the other two. So if you're looking for kind of fun simplicity, I think that the Gunslinger is a really good option. If you kind of want the middle of the road, I would go for the Magus. If you're up for a challenge, the Alchemist could suit you well. And now on to roleplay. I actually think that the ease of roleplay is sort of the reverse of the ease of gameplay with each of these classes. The Alchemist maybe has the most complex mechanics, but I think they have the easiest roleplay, actually. It's kind of a classic mad scientist, or maybe a Jekyll and Hyde, or an assassin with a poison dart. In fact, the roleplay and the flavor of the Alchemist is what drew me to this class in the first place, and I dare say, it is my favorite flavor and role-playing class in the game. With medium complexity and, I would say, medium roleplay, you have the Magus. They're very cool, strength or dex-based, but intelligence-based with spellcasting, so it's easy to imagine them as a very disciplined hybrid warrior. And the subclass options are unique and provide role-playing hooks. They can be ranged and elusive, or there's also kind of a defensive subclass option, so all of that can directly inform your gameplay. And then finally, the Gunslinger, I think, has the relatively easy mechanics, but maybe fewer roleplay hooks than the other two classes. The subclass options, though, do provide a pretty good basis for you. You've got the Drifter and the Triggerband and the Vanguard, who actually kind of mix in some melee with your ranged attacks, which can definitely inform the way you handle your character. The Sniper is very elusive and secretive. The Pistolero is maybe brash and cocky. And, Paizo actually does a surprisingly good job, I would say, with this subclass, providing possible ideas for each one, so you really shouldn't have trouble creating a unique and interesting Gunslinger. And there we have it, the end of the class comparison video series. It's been a wild ride, which involved getting pretty creative here at the end. If you missed any of the other videos in the series, make sure to check those out now. And as always, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. The support I receive really helps me commit to these long-term video projects. And on the note of comments, are there any similarities between these 3 classes that I might have missed? If so, please kindly let me know in the comments below. Until then, remember that if you had all 3 of these classes in an encounter against a creature who was weak to fire damage, you might be able to end that battle, even a severe battle, in a single round. Or you could critically fail on that recall knowledge check and get bad information and take the wrong energy mutagen and actually make yourself weak to the elemental damage that it does and die faster and not do any damage to it. Yeah, just relying on elemental damage isn't always a good idea.